Anton Muller had lived a quiet, inconspicuous life in a small village tucked away in the rolling hills of Bavaria. His world, though humble, was full of warmth and meaning. He worked as a carpenter, a craft he had learned from his father and hoped to pass on to his son, Klaus. The war, which had been creeping across Europe like an unspoken shadow, seemed distant in his small corner of the world. Yet the winds of change were impossible to ignore. Nazi propaganda, with its promises of greatness and the glorification of the fatherland, began to infiltrate every aspect of life. Anton could feel the pressure mounting, but he was never one to indulge in politics. His priorities were simple. He wanted to protect his family, his work, and the life he had built. He didn't subscribe to the rising wave of nationalism. He saw it for what it was, a dangerous illusion that could tear apart the world he knew. It wasn't long, however, before the encroaching forces of war reached Anton's doorstep. In the winter of 1940, the government sent a conscription notice, and Anton's life was irrevocably changed. At first, there was disbelief. He was just a carpenter, a family man. What use could he be in a war? But it didn't matter. The summons was clear, and Anton knew that defying it would mean consequences that could ripple through his life in ways he could not fathom. When he told his wife, Ingrid, about the order, there was a silent understanding between them. She, too, had heard the growing whispers of war and knew what it meant. The fear was palpable, but it was the kind of fear that can't be spoken, only felt. Ingrid held their son Klaus tightly that evening, her eyes full of unspoken worries. Klaus was just 9 years old, a quiet boy who loved to watch his father carve intricate wooden animals and who had begun to show an interest in the family trade. He would be the future of Anton's small business, just as Anton had been the future of his father's. But the looming specter of war altered everything. With Klaus's wide, trusting eyes and the soft curl of his brown hair, Anton's love for his son became a powerful source of pain. The thought of leaving Klaus behind in a world where violence and chaos were rapidly becoming the new normal gnawed at him every day. He found himself wrestling with questions that were far beyond his usual, simple worries. Was he doing the right thing by serving in the military? Was he protecting his family? Or was he just another pawn in the hands of men who had no concern for the lives they were destroying? Yet, when he looked at Klaus, he felt the weight of responsibility, and the questions became less about ideology and more about survival. It wasn't that Anton was unaware of the evils of the Nazi regime. He had heard whispers, had read between the lines of the government speeches, and even had a few quiet conversations with friends who expressed their disillusionment with Hitler's policies. Anton was no fool, but he didn't see himself as a hero. He had no desire to be part of the regime's atrocities. But like so many others, he was swept into the tide. The call to duty, the pressure of national pride, and the fear of being branded a coward or traitor pushed him into a corner from which there was no easy escape. When the day came for Anton to leave, there was no fanfare, no rallying cry. It was a simple, heartbreaking goodbye. Ingrid tried to keep her composure, but her hands trembled as she kissed him goodbye, and Klaus's face was full of confusion. The boy didn't fully understand where his father was going or why. All he knew was that his father had always been there, a constant presence in his life, and now he was leaving. Anton tried to reassure Klaus with promises of return, but he knew the truth. He didn't know when he would come back, or if he ever would. The journey to the front lines was long, filled with dull moments of anticipation and terrifying uncertainty. As Anton boarded the military train, surrounded by men who had been conscripted like him, he couldn't help but feel a pang of fear deep in his gut. These men were strangers, but their faces were etched with the same mix of trepidation and resignation that he felt. As the train rattled across the countryside, Anton gazed out of the window, his mind wandering back to Klaus. What kind of world was his son going to grow up in? Was it already too late for Germany? The days turned into weeks, and Anton found himself stationed in Poland, on the Eastern Front. The harsh winter, with its biting winds and unforgiving cold, made every moment of battle feel like an eternity. It was a far cry from the familiar smells of sawdust in his workshop. Here, the smell of blood, gunpowder, and death pervaded the air. Anton quickly learned that the world of war was no place for ideals. The enemy, be they Polish, Russian, or anyone else, was nothing more than a shadow to be vanquished. In the days that followed, Anton saw things that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The brutality of the soldiers, the senseless violence, and the cold efficiency with which lives were taken, they all became part of the landscape. But despite the horrors, Anton held on to the belief that he was fighting for something greater, something that could justify the darkness surrounding him. His thoughts of Klaus remained a source of solace. When the fighting became too intense, Anton would close his eyes and picture his son back home, safe in their village, playing with his wooden animals and dreaming of a future that seemed so far out of reach. He held on to that image with a kind of desperation, clinging to the hope that, if he could just survive this war, he would be able to return and rebuild. But as the months wore on, Anton found it increasingly difficult to reconcile the man he was becoming with the father he had once been. The war was changing him. The person who had once made simple wooden carvings in his workshop, who had known only the quiet pleasures of family life, was beginning to lose touch with the humanity he had always held dear. He could feel himself becoming more distant, more callous, as the reality of war took its toll. And yet, every time he thought of Klaus, he reminded himself that he had to endure. It was in these quiet moments of internal conflict that Anton truly understood the full weight of the choices before him. War was not just about winning or losing, it was about the choices you made, the price you were willing to pay. For Anton, the price was his soul. Yet, he told himself, it was a price worth paying. It was the price he had to pay to keep his family safe. If he could just make it through this, if he could just survive, then maybe, just maybe, he could return to the life he had once known. But deep down, Anton knew that the war had already taken far more from him than he was willing to admit. The days and weeks on the Eastern Front blurred into one long, unending nightmare for Anton. The snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the battlefield in a cold, oppressive silence that seemed to mock the chaos of war. The soldiers, frozen and exhausted, fought not just their enemies but the elements themselves. Anton had been prepared for battle, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer brutal, soul-crushing nature of life on the front lines. The cold seeped into his bones, and the constant noise of artillery fire, the whistling of bullets, and the shouts of his comrades in agony filled the air. There was no escape from it. There was no time for thought, only action, only survival. In the early days, Anton tried to maintain some semblance of his former self. He would silently repeat to himself that this was temporary, that this war would end, and he would go back to his family. The world of carpentry, of which shavings and the scent of freshly cut timber seemed like a distant dream. Yet, every time he closed his eyes, he would picture his small workshop back in Bavaria, the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth, Klaus at his side, learning the craft that had been passed down through generations. The thought of Klaus was the only thing that kept him from completely losing himself to the madness of war. Anton had heard the stories of the horrors unfolding in the East, of the brutality of the Soviet forces and the dire straits in which the German army found itself. But even those stories seemed far removed from his personal reality, until they weren't. The first time Anton saw a fellow soldier die was like a slap to the face. It wasn't the clinical, distant death he had imagined, some clean and efficient killing in the name of duty. It was ugly. It was loud. It was the kind of death that left you gasping for air, eyes wide in shock, blood turning the snow into something red and unforgiving. The man, a soldier named Dietrich, had been just a few feet away when a Soviet sniper's bullet pierced his throat. There had been no cry, no scream, just a sudden collapse, a spray of red that contrasted sharply with the white snow. Anton had looked away, instinctively, but the image remained burned into his mind. Days turned into weeks, and Anton found himself becoming numb to the death around him. The soldiers in his unit, some of them just boys, others hardened veterans, seemed to share a collective detachment. It wasn't that they lacked feeling, it was that the constant exposure to violence and death had dulled their reactions. They fought because they had to, not because they believed in anything anymore. In a strange way, war had become a shared experience of survival, a survival that was increasingly difficult to cling to. They had learned to laugh in the face of terror, to drink and make jokes to mask their fear. But it was a hollow kind of laughter, a laughter that rang with the bitterness of hopelessness. In the midst of this hell, Anton tried to hold on to the belief that he was still fighting for something greater. He still wore the uniform of a German soldier, still carried out his duties with the precision drilled into him during his training. He could hear the echoes of Nazi slogans in his mind, even if they sounded faint, like voices in the distance. But deep inside, Anton's heart wasn't in it anymore. The grand cause of national pride, of defending the fatherland, had become a lie. It was a lie his government had fed him, one that now seemed more grotesque with every passing day. The more Anton saw of the world beyond the propaganda, the more he understood that the enemy wasn't what he had been told to believe. He had been taught to despise the Russians, to think of them as subhuman, as enemies to be crushed. But in the midst of the fighting, those distinctions had started to fade. The Soviet soldiers were just men like him. They were fighting for their own homes, their own families, driven by the same desperation to survive. One night, after a long day of brutal skirmishes, Anton found himself alone in the trenches. His unit had taken a temporary break from the fighting, but the tension was thick in the air, like a storm waiting to break. He could hear the sounds of distant gunfire, the rumble of artillery, but it all felt so far away, as if the war had become something separate from his existence. As he sat, huddled against the cold earth, Anton found himself thinking of Klaus. He wondered how the boy was faring, what he was doing back home. Was Klaus scared, like he had been when Anton left? Had the war reached their village yet? Was it even safe to think about returning? The questions swirled in Anton's mind, but they were fleeting. It was the war that consumed him now, not the past. His sense of identity had fractured. He was a soldier, yes, but who was he really? Was he the man who had worked with his hands, who had taught his son to carve wood? Or was he just another cog in a vast machine, a machine that had no place for humanity or decency? That night, for the first time, Anton considered what it would be like to surrender. To lay down his rifle and walk away from the madness, from the violence, and from the lies. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he quickly dismissed it. Surrender meant dishonor. It meant failure. It meant the end of everything he had ever known. But as the days wore on, and as the suffering grew more unbearable, that thought began to take root. Anton began to wonder if survival was worth it, if his life and the lives of the men around him were worth sacrificing for a cause that seemed increasingly meaningless. The war was changing him, but it wasn't just the violence and the brutality that were transforming him, it was the constant sense of being trapped. There was no escape from the war, no end in sight. The war had taken everything from him. His beliefs, his values, his identity as a father, a husband, and a man, all of them seemed insignificant in the face of the unrelenting horrors of combat. In the cold, dead silence of the trenches, Anton began to question everything he had ever believed. Was this really the world he had fought for? Was this the future he had envisioned for Klaus? One day, after a particularly vicious encounter with Soviet forces, Anton found himself in a field hospital. His arm had been grazed by a bullet, a minor wound that would have been no more than a flesh wound had the medical conditions been better. The doctors were overwhelmed with casualties, their focus entirely on the men with more serious injuries. As Anton lay on his cot, his mind wandered again to his son. Was Klaus safe? Did he even remember his father? The thought of Klaus, growing up without him, without the guidance and protection that Anton had always intended to provide, was unbearable. It was in this moment of despair that Anton finally understood the true cost of the war. It wasn't just the lives lost, the families shattered, or the cities reduced to rubble. It was the men who were caught in the middle, the soldiers who had been sent to fight a war they didn't understand, for reasons they didn't believe in. Anton realized that he had never truly understood the nature of war, not until now. It wasn't about glory or honor. It wasn't about defending a nation. It was about survival. It was about trying to hold onto your humanity in the face of unimaginable destruction. And in that moment, as Anton lay in that makeshift hospital, bleeding and broken, he made a decision. He would find a way to survive. He would find a way to get back to Klaus, to his family, and to the life he had left behind. The cost of war had been too high, but he was still a man, still a father, and still capable of making choices. The war had taken everything from him, but it hadn't taken his will to live. And that, Anton realized, was the one thing the war could never take away. As the months dragged on, Anton began to feel a creeping sense of helplessness. He was no longer just fighting the enemy, but fighting the very essence of the war itself, the inescapable sense that everything around him was collapsing. The front lines had shifted, and with each passing day, the German forces were pushed further back. The optimism that had initially accompanied his enlistment, the belief that he was part of something important, something historic, had long since faded. Now only survival mattered. The war had become a suffocating blanket of fear and despair that smothered everything else. Anton had been on the front lines for what felt like an eternity, and it seemed as though there was no end in sight. The faces of the men around him, some of them young boys barely older than Klaus, others older and hardened by years of battle, began to blur together, each one marked by the same hollow look of exhaustion. Anton's own reflection, when he caught sight of himself in a dusty mirror in the makeshift barracks, was unrecognizable. His once sturdy frame had withered under the constant strain of war, and the lines of fatigue etched deep into his face spoke more about his inner torment than the war ever could. The sounds of battle had become a dull background hum in his life. There was no distinction anymore between days of quiet and days of carnage. They all bled together into an endless cycle of violence and fear. The smell of death, thick and metallic, lingered in the air, so ingrained in his senses that he no longer even noticed it. The ground was a muddy graveyard of fallen soldiers, both German and Soviet, whose bodies were often left to rot under the relentless onslaught. Anton had seen things he would never forget. Men torn apart by artillery, their faces frozen in screams of agony, comrades who had once laughed around campfires now lying motionless, their eyes glassy and unseeing. The line between the living and the dead had begun to blur. He had become so desensitized to the horror around him that he no longer felt the shock when another soldier fell. His body had learned how to function on autopilot, to move from one battle to the next, without ever truly experiencing the weight of each loss. But in the dark recesses of his mind, Anton knew that something was breaking inside him. There were moments, fleeting and rare, when he allowed himself to think of home, of Klaus and Ingrid, the quiet rhythm of life he had left behind. In those moments, Anton would close his eyes, seeking solace in memories of better times. He remembered the smell of Ingrid's cooking filling their small home, the warmth of their hearth crackling in the cold nights. He thought of the way Klaus's face lit up when Anton would return from a long day's work in the shop, his son's eager questions about how to carve and shape wood, the joy of teaching him a craft that had been passed down through generations. The boy was growing up without him. Anton couldn't help but feel the deep pang of guilt that came with that thought. Was Klaus safe? Had the war reached their village yet? Every time the question crossed his mind, it filled him with dread. He had heard rumors, whispers, really, about how the Allied forces were closing in on Germany. Would they be spared? Or would Klaus and Ingrid become just another casualty in a world ravaged by violence? Then came the night that would change everything. It was a night like any other, or at least it seemed so at first. The camp was eerily quiet, the soldiers weary from yet another day of constant movement and sporadic skirmishes with Soviet forces. There was no sound but the faint crackling of the campfire and the low murmurs of men trying to hold on to whatever semblance of comfort they could find. Anton sat alone on a rotting wooden bench, his thoughts drifting like smoke. The weight of his decisions, the war, the distance from his family, the growing awareness that this war was a lost cause, began to press on him like a physical force. He felt as if he was drowning, and there was no air to breathe. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. It was one of his comrades, a young man named Johann. Johann had been part of Anton's unit since the beginning of the war, a quiet, gentle soul who had joined the army out of duty, not conviction. He had never been comfortable with the violence of war, and it showed in his eyes, the eyes of a man who had seen too much. Johann was different from the others. Where many soldiers had learned to laugh in the face of death, Johann had remained somber, perhaps too somber for a world that had already lost its humanity. Anton had grown fond of him over the months, seeing in him a reflection of the man he used to be before the war had consumed him. Johann sat next to Anton, his face gaunt from lack of sleep and hunger, his eyes searching Anton's face, as though looking for something to cling to. "Do you think it will ever end?" Johann asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Anton turned to face him, startled by the question. It was the first time anyone had spoken openly about the futility of the war. Most of the men had either resigned themselves to their fate or buried their doubts under layers of anger and pride. But Johann was different. He had the courage to ask the question that Anton had been avoiding for so long. "I don't know," Anton said quietly, his voice thick with the weight of his own uncertainty. "I used to believe we were fighting for something greater. But now, I'm not sure what we're fighting for anymore." Johann nodded, a sad, resigned expression on his face. "I don't think any of us know anymore. We're just trying to stay alive, trying to make it through another day." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Anton had never spoken so frankly about the war, not even with his closest friends. The reality was too painful to confront. But in Johann's eyes, Anton saw something he had been hiding from, a reflection of his own doubt, his own fear that the war had no purpose, that it had become a mindless, endless cycle of destruction. For the first time since the war began, Anton felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was not hope, there was little hope left, but it was a realization that, perhaps, it was time to think differently. The war had robbed him of everything he once held dear, his home, his work, his dignity, but it had not taken his ability to choose. He could still choose how he responded to this madness. The realization hit him like a wave, overwhelming and undeniable. He didn't have to keep fighting this senseless war. He didn't have to sacrifice his humanity to survive. There was a way out, even if he didn't know what that path looked like. That night, as he lay in the dark, Anton made a decision. He would find a way to survive, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. He would do whatever it took to preserve the man he once was, the father, the husband, the man who believed in something greater than war. The thought of Klaus, growing up in a world of devastation, was the spark that ignited something deep within him. Anton could not and would not let this war define him. He would find a way back to his family, to his life, and to the man he had been before this madness began. The next morning, as the sun rose over the bleak horizon, Anton felt a strange sense of resolve. The war might not end soon, but for the first time in months, he was no longer consumed by the idea of duty. He was driven by something else, a deep, unshakable need to return home. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about redemption. And Anton knew, deep in his heart, that the first step toward redemption was to reject the lies of war and take control of his own fate. The days blurred together for Anton as the war ground on, its relentless march eroding any hope of an easy end. The once proud German army had been pushed back on multiple fronts, and Anton felt the pressure mounting with each passing day. The harsh conditions of the Eastern Front had taken their toll on him, physically and emotionally. His body had withered from the constant exposure to the cold and the unrelenting pace of the battles, and his mind had begun to fracture under the weight of it all. He had witnessed things he would never be able to forget, men torn apart by artillery shells, comrades who once shared stories of home now reduced to silent, hollow shells of their former selves. Anton had become numb to the constant cycle of violence. His sense of identity, his beliefs, his understanding of right and wrong, all of it had been chipped away, piece by piece. What had once seemed like an honorable cause now felt like a monstrous machine that consumed everything in its path. But it was during one of these moments of utter despair, as Anton lay in a field hospital, that his world would shift in a way he could never have anticipated. The injury that had brought him here, a shallow wound to his shoulder, not enough to kill but enough to force him into temporary inaction, seemed trivial compared to the horror of the battle he had left behind. He had been in enough skirmishes to know that wounds like his were nothing to fear. It was the emotional and psychological toll of the war that had him truly shaken. The world had become a landscape of horrors, and Anton was no longer sure if he was part of the solution or just another cog in the monstrous machine that was the Nazi war effort. As he lay there, staring up at the ceiling of the makeshift hospital, he heard the shuffle of boots approaching. It was a British officer, his uniform slightly different from the ones Anton had grown accustomed to seeing. The officer had the look of a man who had been through his own share of battles. His face was lean, weathered, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was flanked by a small group of medics who were busy tending to other wounded soldiers, but the officer made his way directly to Anton's bed. "Are you the German soldier, Müller?" the officer asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Anton blinked in confusion. The question seemed almost irrelevant to him at this point. The war had become so vast, so impersonal, that the idea of him as an individual had almost faded away. He was just another soldier, another number in the grand scheme of things. "Yes," Anton replied hoarsely, his voice thick with exhaustion. "I am." The officer nodded, but there was no triumph in his eyes. No anger. No hatred. Just something that Anton couldn't place, something that made his stomach churn. The officer looked around the room before speaking again. "I'm Major Jameson. I've been assigned to oversee this camp. You're a prisoner now, Müller. But I want you to know that we will treat you as a soldier, not a criminal." Anton stiffened at the words, but it wasn't fear that made his body tense. It was the sheer absurdity of it. A prisoner of war? Treated as a soldier? The world had gone mad. Anton had been raised to see the British as enemies, as a symbol of everything Germany had been fighting against. But here was a British officer, standing in front of him, offering something that no one had ever expected. Respect. A strange kind of respect. For a moment, Anton's mind refused to process it. He had expected to be treated with disdain, to be mocked, or even worse, to be executed as a traitor. But instead, the British officer was offering him something he had not received in months: humanity. The truth of it settled slowly in his mind, like a heavy weight. This man, Major Jameson, was not what he had been taught to believe. He was not a monster. He was a man, just like Anton, caught in a war that had torn both their worlds apart. "I'm not your enemy," Major Jameson continued, as if sensing the confusion in Anton's eyes. "You're a soldier, and we'll treat you as one. We'll treat you with dignity, as any soldier deserves. The war will end. But when it does, we'll all have to rebuild. I can promise you that we'll do our part to make sure you return home to your family." Anton's heart skipped a beat at the mention of home. His family, the very thought of them, had become a distant dream. The war had consumed his thoughts to such an extent that he had almost forgotten what it was like to have a future, to have something to return to. The idea that the British could offer him the chance to go home, to reunite with Klaus and Ingrid, seemed impossible. But here was a man, a British officer, who seemed to believe that it was possible. And for the first time in years, Anton felt the smallest glimmer of hope. As the days passed, Anton came to understand the depth of the respect that Major Jameson had shown him. It wasn't just a fleeting moment of kindness. It was something deeper, something rooted in the officer's character. Anton was treated with a level of dignity that he had never expected from an enemy soldier. His wounds were tended to with care, the food rations were enough to sustain him, and the officers of the camp ensured that he had clean bedding and proper rest. The kindness was almost overwhelming. But the real shock came when Anton realized that the British officers were not the barbaric invaders he had been taught to fear. They were men just like him, struggling to survive in a world that had gone mad. In the camp, Anton's fellow soldiers were just as bewildered as he was. They had been told that the British were ruthless, that they would show no mercy to German soldiers. But as they settled into the camp, they were faced with a different reality. The British did not humiliate them, as they had been led to believe. They were treated with respect, given enough to eat, and allowed to rest without the constant fear of retaliation. The very notion of British brutality seemed to dissolve in the face of this unexpected humanity. It was a shock to Anton's system, one that he struggled to comprehend. How could the British be so kind when they were supposed to be the enemy? Over time, Anton found himself conversing more with Major Jameson and the other British soldiers in the camp. They spoke of their families, of their homes, of their lives before the war had torn everything apart. Anton learned that Major Jameson had lost 2 brothers in the war, both of them killed in action. Despite his own personal grief, the officer remained committed to the principles of respect and dignity for all soldiers, regardless of nationality. His words were simple, but they had a profound impact on Anton. Jameson spoke often about the future, about the world that would emerge after the war's end. "The war is not the end of everything," he would say. "It's only a chapter. And after the war, we all have to rebuild, no matter where we come from." The conversations were a small but vital lifeline for Anton. They allowed him to see the world through a different lens. He began to understand that the enemy he had been fighting wasn't truly his enemy at all. The real enemy, he realized, was the war itself. The propaganda, the lies, the hatred that had been fed to him and millions of others. The war had turned men like him into pawns, forcing them to fight for causes they never fully understood, for reasons they never questioned. But now, as a prisoner in a British camp, Anton saw that it wasn't too late to change. It wasn't too late to reclaim his humanity. Days turned into weeks, and Anton's time in the camp began to heal some of the wounds that had festered inside him for so long. He began to understand that respect could be given, even to those who had once been labeled as enemies. The kindness he received from Major Jameson and the other British soldiers made him question everything he had ever known. The realization that men, even in the midst of war, could still show compassion, could still offer kindness and respect, shattered the foundation of his previous beliefs. It was a humbling experience, one that he would never forget. The war would continue for months, but for Anton, it had already begun to change. The idea of honor and duty, once so important to him, had been turned on its head. He had been given a second chance, one that he hadn't expected. The British had shown him something far more valuable than survival. They had shown him respect, and in doing so, they had given him back a part of his soul that the war had almost destroyed. The days in the British prisoner of war camp had stretched into what felt like an eternity, yet for Anton, it was a time of quiet reflection and slow, subtle transformation. The constant hum of battle, the endless days of trudging through mud and snow, had been replaced by a strange stillness that left room for thoughts that had been buried beneath the weight of war. The camp, though far from comfortable, was a place of peace compared to the front lines. The men who surrounded him, some German, some British, were no longer enemies. They were simply men, weary from fighting, each of them longing for the same thing: to survive, to return home, to rebuild their lives. Anton had long ago stopped viewing the British as enemies. The respect they had shown him, the simple humanity they had extended in the face of his own perceived humiliation, had cracked open a door in his mind, one that led to an entirely new understanding of what it meant to be human. He spent long hours sitting by the campfire, speaking with the other prisoners. They told stories of their homes, their families, their lives before the war had consumed them. Anton learned of the lives of the men around him, not just as soldiers, but as fathers, husbands, sons. It was in these conversations that Anton realized the true cost of war. It wasn't just the destruction of cities or the loss of lives, it was the shattering of families, the erasure of futures. The soldiers in the camp, whether German or British, had all been caught in the same machine, and each one of them had paid a price. Anton began to understand that war didn't just take lives, it took people's identities, their dreams, and their hopes for the future. He had been so focused on survival, on getting through each day, that he had failed to see the larger picture. One evening, as Anton sat alone by the campfire, he found himself staring into the flames, lost in thought. The crackling fire seemed to mirror his own internal turmoil, the flames flickering and dancing in the wind. He had heard from some of the other prisoners about the growing sense of desperation among the German high command. The war was clearly nearing its end. The Allies were advancing on all fronts, and the Nazis' once mighty empire was crumbling. For Anton, this knowledge was bittersweet. He knew the end of the war would bring peace, but it would also bring consequences. He would have to return home, but what kind of home would it be? What would Klaus think of him after all this time? Would Ingrid still be there, waiting for him, or would the war have torn their lives apart in ways he couldn't even imagine? The questions gnawed at him, but there were no answers. All he could do was wait, just like the rest of them.